Welcome to the Powerful Panels podcast. This is Kristin Arnold, and I am a professional panel moderator on a quest to make all panel discussions lively and informative. This week, I am so excited. We have the incredibly brilliant and masterful Joe Calloway, who I have known for over 20 some odd years. And Joe is a serial entrepreneur. He loves a good bourbon. And he works a lot with small businesses, particularly startups, but he has been a member of the National Speakers Association Speaker Hall of Fame for, I think, probably close to 20 years, and is a legend on the speaking stage. And so I welcome my friend, Joe Calloway.
Thank you. And it just hit me. Let me feel even older. I've been a CPAE for 31 years.
Oh my, I did not you get your CPAE, but you're a rock star. And I gotta tell our listeners, our viewers, however you're accessing this podcast, is Joe Calloway is one of those people who has this innate sense of working with the room. Whether he's on the stage in a large group, whether it's a small group. And one of the things that he's done masterfully is to actually bring a panel discussion in the middle of his speech, which the first time I saw this, I went, oh my God, you can do that? Really? So I thought we would have a conversation with my buddy Joe Calloway about, number one, how did you come up with this idea? And give us the inside skinny about how to make that happen so that if we want to do that, we know how to do it. So thank you so much for being here, Joe. And tell us a little bit about how did you even come up with this idea of a panel in your speech?
Thrilled to be here. And I love something that you just said, a little phrase. And thank you. You said that I was really good at working with the room. And when you said that, I thought, I love that. I love putting it that way because fairly shortly into my career, I got turned off of the idea of giving a speech and really turned off on the idea of giving the perfect speech, giving the perfectly rehearsed every gesture, every pause being meaningful. Oh, yeah,
This is why we get along so well.
It is. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, that style, the very rehearsed polished speaking, works extremely well for some people, and their audiences absolutely love it. It's just not me. I prefer to, this is my new phrase, I'm a super, I prefer to work with the room. And so part of my journey, Kristin, was I played with doing interaction with the audience. I would ask a question like, everybody in the room, if you were to name a company that you think is incredibly innovative right now, who would it be? And they would think and maybe talk to each other a little bit, but I would say, okay, so somebody tell me who you came up with. And they'd name a company, and my thing was always about researching my clients and knowing everything I could possibly know about business and what was working in business. So somebody would name a company, and it was rare. Even if it was a relatively unknown company, it was rare that they'd name a company that I wasn't familiar with. And so we'd have a mini conversation. And I'd say, oh, that's a great point. Let me tell you something else that company's doing that everybody in this room could do, that sort of thing. So then that transformed to, well, what if I brought them up on stage with me? That evolved into, and this was, and I did a bunch of these panels on stage. I mean, I did a couple of hundred of them. And probably the most obvious one to me was when I was working with a sales group, because I was across the board. I worked with all kinds of companies, all size companies, and I did a lot with sales for a while. I wasn't real niche in any particular area. Whichever, if I were to do it over again, I think I would be more niche. But if I was working with a sales group, I would tell the meeting planner, whoever I was talking to, the VP, the CPO, I'd say, let me tell you something I'd like to do. I'd like to take 15 minutes in my 1 hour keynote, 15 minutes, give or take. And I would love to have 3 of your top performers up on stage with me. And what we'll do is the setup would be 4 bar stools. And we'll all be sitting there. And I will have a discussion with them about how they do what they do and why it works. And so, and I would call each one of them, obviously, before the event, and I'd say, here's what we're going to talk about. And the ground rules are, I'm going to throw out a question, and I would get to know each of them, and I'd say, okay, Susan, that's fascinating to me that you do that. At some point in our on-stage discussion, I'm going to ask you about that. And she'd say, great. And I would tell them, here are the ground rules. This truly is going to be a conversation, because you said you like to make panels lively and informative. Panels can be deadly. You know that better than anybody.
Why I got into this.
You've seen it. That's what you're trying to fix. They can just be so awful. But a lively panel with some value and usable information, to me, that's better than a speech. But just to me, as a consumer, as an audience member.
Especially
So
when it's a discussion, a conversation, and not a presentation.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I've been on panels where the person before the event would say, okay, here are the 6 questions I'm going to ask. And I will just go down the row and I will rotate who I start with. And each of you will have 2 minutes. And here are the 6 questions. So do your, and I thought, so what we're doing is 18 mini speeches, 18 little prepared answers with no interaction beyond the answer, the setup of answering the question. There was no juice. There was no energy. There was no liveliness. And so I worked really hard to make sure that whoever was going to be on the panel, and Kristin, usually the event planner was pretty savvy and would help me out, or the whoever I was working with, and they would pick people that they knew were going to be pretty good or comfortable. But every now and then somebody'd be a little nervous, and I'd say, look, what you're going to be doing is no different than what you and I are doing on the phone right now. It's honestly, there are no right or wrong answers. This is just picking stuff around. I would even go so far as to tell them, I'd say, I will very likely interrupt you, so one of you at least at some point. I'll say, Kristin, wait, whoa, just a second. Hang on, because you just said something that I think is crazy important. Say that again to everybody and go a little bit deeper on that. I'd say, and part of the reason I'm going to interrupt you is because I want you to feel free to interrupt each other, or, hey, what you just said reminded me of something. So lively was an operative word.
Okay, so you picked a really good, juicy topic of like the A players in the organization talking about their best practices.
Yes.
You kind of seeded each person. You had at least one thing that you were going to dive, that you knew that you wanted to like dive a little deeper in.
Yep.
Okay, tell us, and you had one-on-one conversations with each of the panelists. Tell us a little bit more about your preparation before you actually facilitate or brought them up on stage.
Yeah, and that was for me so vitally important. For me to carry on an intelligent conversation with them, I had to understand
Yeah.
what they did and understand what the company did and understand what are you trying to achieve with this event and how can what I do, including the panel, help advance that? How can you walk away from this saying, oh my gosh, what just happened was so helpful and that panel was crazy helpful.
So the panel is in alignment with the organization's objectives, the meeting's objective, what you were supposed to be speaking about. I'm assuming it's all connected. You're
absolutely
sure that it just makes it pop.
It totally does. And let me tell you the other for the speakers that are listening and or watching right now. Here's a huge bonus. I can stand in front of an audience and say, and I used to always say to my audiences, I'm not really going to give you a lot of my opinion. I'm a reporter. I'm going to talk to you about what works. It's not up for debate because I'm going to give you concrete examples of companies. But that was still me telling them, here's an example of what works. Here's an example of what works. Now I've got their colleagues saying, here's what works. Here are my results. They weren't saying this out loud, but this was the underlying thing. You can't argue with this. These are three people that do what all of you do, and they are all really successful, and here's how they do it. So it's not just me saying it. I've got these three other people that are backing me up. And if they were good at what they do, and they always were, then I could easily tie my perspective after the panel was over. I'd say, for example, I want to go back to something Bob said because it's a great lead in to what I was going to talk about next with you. Bob said, boom, 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 boom. And so it gave my message, Kristin, so much more credibility because it wasn't just me. It was three of them that were saying, yeah, that this is what works.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your setup. Because you kind of know what the panel is generally going to be talking about, but you're working without a net. You don't know what's going to come out of their mouths. So do you kind of tee up some of the principles ahead of time in your speech, and then you bring the panel, and then you drive it home? Like, what's your thought process about where you put the panel and the content?
It's interesting. Time-wise, where I put the panel in the speech was usually about 30 minutes in. And so we would do 15 to 20 minutes, which left me 20 to 15 minutes to finish up my part of the speech. And it's interesting that the companies that I worked with, so many of them, Kristin, hired me because they read one of my books. Well, they're either saying, yeah, this guy makes complete sense to us. And usually the next thought was, this is what our best people do. I mean, I could pick any one of 100 principles I talked about or ideas I talked about, but it was really rare. I'm hard pressed to remember a time that, even though every now and then there would be disagreement. I do remember one guy, great guy. He was so great. He was in Naples, Florida, at the Ritz-Carlton down there. And he said, Joe, you talked about such and such. He said, I take a little bit different approach, which is great.
Great for a panel, actually.
Yes. And he said what he did. And I said, oh my God. I said, that's solid gold. And it's not at all. Our ideas are not in conflict. They're just different ways of doing it. I love what you just said. That's a beautiful idea. So, and you're right, that actually, when you get that kind of a little bit of push and pull going, that makes it livelier. That makes it juicier. And you're working without a net. And there's a skill set involved. and knowing how to do that. And I just little by little kind of figured out how to do it, at least to the extent that I did. But
you are a master on many different levels, just interviewing people in the audience, to a panel, to just integrating something that you heard in the hallway on the fly right before you started your speech. I mean, so let us not quibble about your ability. I just want everybody to know that we are talking to a master facilitator here.
You know, it's interesting. I was, bureaus represent me as a keynote speaker, but in my bio and in my introduction in front of the group, it said, Joe doesn't do speeches, but rather leads conversations that you know, improve performance, So, but it's funny. I was in keynote slots. I was billed as a keynote speaker, but I got away with doing all this really interactive stuff, and the clients were good with it. I did, you know, occasionally have a client say, and I didn't always do a panel. I mean, sometimes I would suggest it, and they would say, no, you know, we'd rather not. Well, that's fine. I can do the whole hour. But I did say, I do some interactive stuff with the audience. And I remember one guy saying, well, we're not going to pay you to have our people talk. So we don't want that part. We just want the straight speech. And I said, well, that's not what I do, and that's not how I work. But there's tons of people out there that'll be a perfect fit for you. Because I got to the point where I didn't know how to give a speech anymore, where I did all the talking. I didn't like it. It didn't feel right.
So this panel concept kind of grew and morphed into something that you felt very, very comfortable. So why don't you walk us through, like, literally the mechanics of, you know, you've been speaking for a while and now you're like, okay, we're going to have a panel. How'd you bring people on stage? How did you introduce them?
Yeah, I would say, and I've got a couple of examples besides sales audience examples that I remember clearly to this day that I want to share with everybody, because they were really just out of the park successes. But as far as the mechanics, I would get to a point in my speech where I'd say, you know, I've been talking a lot, boy, and I'm trying to remember how I set it up, but I'd say something to the effect of, you know, I've been talking about these ideas, and yet there are a lot of people in this room that are really, I mean, you guys are good at what you do. I know that. I know who you are. If I were true, if I wasn't working with a company that was in desperate trouble, which was not my audience anyway, so I didn't tend to be. But I'd say, you guys are really what you do. I thought it would be really useful and interesting to bring 3 of your colleagues up on stage with me. And the stools were already there. There were 4 bar stools sitting beside the lectern. So they probably, they were probably thinking, what's up with the stools? And so then I say, I'd like to bring 3 of your colleagues up to kick around some of these ideas as they work in your real world. Awesome. And so let's let your best tell me and each other what they're doing that works, and see how it fits with what I've been telling you.
Awesome. So so do you name the people and they?
Yes. I'd say, let me invite to the stage, Kristin Arnold, Mark Sanborn, Scott McCain. Would you 3 come on up? Give me a hand, everybody. And they'd come up, and I'd say, you know who these guys are, but real quickly, Kristin is in such and such area of the company, has been with the company for 8 years, So just a tiny little 15 seconds on who they were. But it was literally as simple as that. Here's what I want to do: bring up some your real world perspectives about all of this that I'm talking about. 3 terrific people in your company, Susan, James, and William. Come on up. And I would lead them and they would applaud and they'd come up. And then I'd say, okay, let me start with this. And I'd just throw a question out. And I'd say, whoever wants it, take it. And I'd throw it out.
Whoever wants it, take it.
Yeah, and usually one of them would. And if they didn't, I'd say, well, okay, I'm going to make you talk. Jimmy, what do you think about that? Because I know you're good at this. So what's your take on it? How does it work? But it's interesting. It was playful. We had fun, but it was serious business. I mean, it was all about the value of this segment, and it had to be real. Otherwise, the client would have said, what was up with the panel thing? That just seemed real gimmicky to me.
Yeah.
And that would have killed the whole thing, obviously.
So there's a fine line between gimmicky and playful, that authentic kind of, hey, come on down, and who wants to kick it off, and I think a lot of that is dependent on, number one, the moderator style, the culture of the audience, and then
yes,
you have as panelists. So you probably were feeding a little bit off of who was actually selected for you, and how did you help them just dive in? Because 15 minutes isn't really a long time, and they have to be concise and crisp and get their points across. How did you kind of coach them through that?
We would mostly through just talking about it beforehand. And let me back up though, because you said something that's so important. Two things. Number one, the way I did it, I was being me. I was absolutely 100% being me. It's just the way I do it. I'm not a real buttoned up speaker. I never was. And so there was no change in me from the speech to the panel in terms of how I was being with the audience. I was exactly the same person all the way through. I wasn't playing a part. The other thing is the audiences are different. I remember a group, this is funny, another Florida group just popped into my head. And my panelists one was a Wall Street analyst of the industry that my client was in. One was, he worked for a publication that covered that industry. And then the other one was somebody equally as weighty, gravitas. And this was, listen, it's rare that I can't have at least a little bit of fun with any audience. But this was a serious audience, and these 3, especially that Wall Street analyst, they were serious. And so I didn't josh around with them because it wouldn't have fit.
Right.
I was trying to work with the room. And I was trying to work with the panelists and not try and have them be something that they weren't. So,
but you still stayed authentic to you, but just toned your kind of natural style down to meet what culturally would work.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's so important. You're still you. And you're, because I think we have to make the panelists feel safe and comfortable and willing to share some of their secrets.
Yeah.
On behalf of the audience. It's all about the audience. The audience has to get really good takeaways, or why have a panel?
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing, and I used to have this standard when I was doing the talking, is, am I telling them stuff they already know? If I'm doing that, or we're doing that, what's the point? I mean, there's something to be said for reinforcement, but people didn't bring me in really to do that. They brought me in to have them bump it up a little bit. And this whole go to the next level thing. I've got to tell you about the most successful in-speech panel I ever did.
Oh, please, please.
Wow. It was one of the best moments of my career, Chris. I'm not kidding. And it's USAA, great insurance company. And, you know, they deal with ex-military. My gosh, I was so impressed with that company, their culture, their leadership, everything. Well, once a year, I don't know if they still do it, but once a year they had, and they had been doing this for years, the top 100 leaders in the company, the top in rank 100 people in the company. And I was there for 2.5 days. I did a couple of things that were just me on stage, but their meeting planner was so great. And in researching the company, I read so many customer reviews and so much feedback about their customer service reps, the people that answer the phone. And so I was talking with the meeting planner about it, and this idea evolved, and she and I developed it together. But I said, seems to me those people are so important to this company. And she said, they're vitally, vitally important. I said, what if we had 3 of your best customer service reps that work in the call center do a panel, and I talk to them in front of the 100 top people in the company? Kind of reversing, because usually it's the top people in the company talking to the people in the call center.
The CSRs are not usually invited to that swing.
She said, I love it. And I said, well, let's think about our 3 people. And of course, that was mostly her working with the managers in the company. They picked out 3 people. I called them all beforehand, talked about it a lot. And we talked about, why is what you do important? Why does what you do and what your company does, what USAA does, why is it important to you? I mean, you guys are obviously good at what you do. The feedback says that. Why do you care? And we did about 15 minutes with the 3 of them, and they would pass it back and forth, and I would help them move it along. But it was really about just that one idea. Why does this matter to you? Why do you care? And they talked a lot about what that customer means to me, to them personally. And we're taking care of them. I mean, they trust us. And that's a lot of responsibility that I have. And there were all this stuff. My gosh, at the end of it, standing huge ovation from the 100 top people, some of whom were taking out handkerchiefs.
I thought you were starting to cry there, Joe.
Oh my gosh, I may start just slobbering any minute. But the CEO, who was a retired general, Army general, gosh, such a great guy. He came upstairs and up on stage and shook hands with each of the 3 and said, thanks, Joe. That was incredible. And so we all walked off the stage, and Kristin, he just stood at the lectern and shook his head. He said, is this the most powerful thing we've ever seen on a stage in one of these meetings? And again, they all just went crazy. He said, this is what we need to do, is have the people that do it talk to us, give us some presentations. And so it started, and they repeated. They started doing employee panels for the senior people. And that was just magic, but it shows the power of a panel and the potential of a panel and the value that can be there. But so, you can use your imagination with these things. You can come up with different approaches to it. I think just the things that we've said, the preparation, being authentic, and the value. Where's the value? Is there value here?
Okay, so Joe, how do you close it off? Because you're not really closing off your speech, but you're closing the panel. So how do you elegantly wrap it with a bow and get them back off the stage?
You know, I can't recall a panel that didn't do a good job. They all made me look good by just bringing them up. So really, I would say something like, okay, and I would generally ask, like the CEO of USAA did, I would generally say something like, I would just say, thank you, Kristin. And I would stop. That was the end of the questioning. I didn't say it was the end. That's just the last thing I said to them. And I would turn to the audience and I'd say, what do you think? Did you get some useful ideas? Did you get some good ideas? And without fail, they always like, yes, this was great. And I'd say, thank our panel members. Great job. And they would all, because people love cheering for their own, way more than they love cheering for me. And so it was, whoop, 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 and they'd go back into the audience and everybody's patting them on the back and hugging them. Well, that makes the room feel that much better for my final 15, 20 minutes. So it was it just worked so well for me. But I tell you what, it's really a commitment because it adds a lot. It's way beyond just writing the keynote speech. Now you got a whole other animal in there that you really got to, it's everything that you talk about. You've got to do it right. But if you do it right, wow.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of intentionality, a lot more pre-work.
That's a great word.
Of that conversation with the meeting organizer, making sure it's all aligned, picking right people that are eloquent as well as have the expertise and that are willing to share maybe some of their own best practices. And then you're taking the risk too, because you don't know what they're going to be saying.
Yeah.
Oh, but you know what? My experience as a facilitator is if you do a good amount of the preparation and laying the foundation, it's going to be fine. It might not be an awesome kick it out of the ballpark, but it'll be fine.
No, it'll be good. It'll be good,
which is great because it adds more interest to the program. And, we're now living in a world where I don't think keynotes are going more than 45 minutes, maybe an hour. So having a panel somewhere in the middle gives it some of that, additional energy in the room. But it's not for the faint of heart.
It's not for the faint of heart. And it's not and this is totally legit. There are some speakers that may be thinking, if I've got 1 hour or 45 minutes, I got a lot of stuff I want to say. No, I want it to be all me, and that's fine. This is just another way to do it that worked extremely well for me. Is one of the best things I did in my career was starting to do these.
Okay, so Joe, you just brought up something in my head that I'm like, oh, I want to dig a little bit deeper on this one.
Okay.
The keynoter, of course, you're the sage on the stage. As the moderator of the panel, you're the guide on the side.
Yep.
So you're trying to pull out the wisdom of the group. And of course, you can punctuate things. I mean, you're awesome at doing that. One of the dangers, I think, for keynoters is to move from being that guide on the side to being the sage on the stage during the panel. Tell me a little bit about what you do to what are your guardrails to make sure that you're approaching that appropriately, because after all, they are paying you for your wisdom.
They are, and it's a balance during the panel. I mean, I had mantras. During the panel, there was a voice that was kind of in my unconscious, but it was unconsciousness or unconscious, but it was saying, this is about them. This is about them. This is about them. I'll have my turn again in a few minutes. And I would punctuate, I would punctuate, and I would throw in with them. That was part of what made it work, to blend my perspective with theirs. But I have seen, I'm thinking of a couple of very specific examples. I've seen examples where the panel was 50% the moderator talking. The moderator just took over. And if it's designed to be that way, if that's with intention, and if that creates the greatest value, that's fine. But the two instances I'm thinking about, it was just a speaker that could not shut up. you know, they just couldn't. If there was a microphone around, they were going to be talking. But here's the thing. If the panel, they are stars, if they do a really good job, it so makes me the hero for being the one that had the idea and brought them up and put it together.
And creates that spotlight, that energy. Whereas if you talk too much, you're sucking up that energy and you're shifting the spotlight from them, which is your purpose, to you, which you are masterful at, like, just creating that conversation so that it seems very natural, and that you're connecting the dots for the audience.
Yeah, it's I'm just thinking about the use of this, and the word useful comes up for me as a speaker. It was super quick example, a home building company in Texas, excellent company, great culture, very successful. They were riding the crest of 3 or 4 years of unprecedented success. And in the midst of all that, they were going to change. They were going to make massive changes to how they did a lot of stuff. And this was just rolling out, and the employees, managers, everybody were very uneasy. In talking with the CEO, I said, I've got an idea, because I really want to talk about this change you're going through. He said, yeah, I want you to. I said, you're scheduled for an hour speech before my hour speech. Let me bounce this off of you. You take 30 minutes, I take 30 minutes, then you, me, and maybe, based on what you're telling me, the COO and maybe your head of sales, you guys come up on stage and I talk to you about this change and what it's going to look like. And we do maybe just 30 or 40 minutes on that. And then they lead the stage and it's just you and me sitting there. And I talk to you about the why. Why are you doing this? I mean, really, there seems like there's no need.
You're successful if it ain't broke.
Yeah. And he said, let's do it. And that was another one that was such a success. And the feedback the CEO got and that I got afterwards was the people in the audience said, we understood the nuts and bolts of the change, but we didn't know how, I'll call him Jim, the CEO, felt about it and why he truly in his heart believed it was the best thing for all of us. And during his speech, he talked about the need for the change, but it was in the conversation that his feelings came out. And so a conversation's different than a speech. It just reveals a lot of things that generally aren't revealed in a speech. So that's another one where I just, was kind of creative with it and said, cut my speech in half, cut your speech in half, bring these other two people, then just you and me. And it worked.
So speech, panel, interview.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so Joe, this has been awesome. I really do appreciate all of your wisdom, especially it's not about me, it's about them. It gets a great mantra in your head just to kind of make sure that you're staying focused and on track. Is there any other tips ideas that you wanted to mention that you haven't had an opportunity to mention?
You know, I think this just popped into my mind, and it's kind of going back to what we started talking about. But being sure that you've got clarity, and whoever you're coordinating the meeting with, the meeting planner, the whatever people in the company, that when you tell them, when you give them this idea, they're at least going, this is the same when you're trying to sell your topic as a speaker, that their reaction is, I get it. I understand your concept here. And then they might say, yeah, let's talk about that. That sounds pretty cool. Or they might say, I get it, I understand, and no, don't want to do that. That's fine. But if they don't understand, there's no way they're going to say yes to it. And part of that, you know, conveying the idea is you've got to convey the value. You've got to say, here's why. It's not just to shake up a presentation. Here's what will make the whole hour. Here's why it will make it so much better, or can make it so much better, because they might say no. And so you don't want to say, if you don't do the panel, then it's going to be 70% as good. So even in the explaining of it, it's a balance. But you've got to get clarity in your own mind and be able to express that clarity about what you're going to do and why it can be a great option for them.
Right. Right. And here's how it feeds your objectives. Here's how it highlights some of the people making stars. You know, do you ever surprise a meeting organizer with this? Like, just go, I'm going to do it anyway?
No, but the biggest surprise was at a panel that I was on at NSA, and I bet you might have been in the room. It was in San Diego, and it was 3 great speakers and me and a great speaker moderator. And about 10 minutes, you talk about reading the room. There were 100 speakers in there, Kristin, that were like this.
Ooh.
And so about 10 minutes into it, and I was good enough friends with all of these people that I felt like, I'm going to do this. I said, could we stop for a second? You talk about a surprise. I said, could we stop for a second? Is it just me? Is this working or not working? And about 20 people out loud said, it's not working. And one person said, so correctly, said, for one thing, there's 5 men on the stage. And Patricia Fripp was sitting in the front row, and somebody said, there's Fripp right there. And I said, get another stool. Well, Patricia on stage, you know Patricia,
oh yeah,
she immediately shifted the energy in the room. And it shifted the energy for the whole thing. It still wasn't a great panel. It wasn't well thought out. It wasn't the right combination of people. But all
those preparation things, it can sink a panel.
It sank that panel. But that's the biggest surprise I ever pull on anybody. I'm sure the speaker that put it together for me to say, time out, is this working? And to have the room go, no.
That's awesome. And that you felt comfortable enough as a panelist to do that.
Well, that's the thing. And you know what? The other 3 that were up there with me, I remember one of them leaned over and went, thank you.
Yeah.
I think it might have been Scott McCain, as I remember. But anyway, yeah, you've got to be secure enough in who you are and authentic enough to sometimes be able to roll with the punches and change gears and decisions on the fly and all that stuff. And having said all that, sometimes you do the best you can do and you go, I called Dale Irvin after a speech one time, and I said, Dale, you ever do one of those speeches that after it's over, you just go, wow, that was a waste of everybody's time? He said, you mean the one where the meeting planner comes up afterwards, pats you on the shoulder and says, nice try? I said, yes, I just did one of those. So not everything's gonna be a knockout of the park, like we were saying. Yeah. But most of them will be good if you prepare.
Preparation has a lot to do. What is it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Sure. So, Joe, you are a master. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Any final one thing that if we were to take away from this, if we wanted to do a panel in the middle of a speech, what would you recommend we do?
I would recommend you try it if you have the luxury of this with a client that you've already worked with, that you've got good relationships, they trust you, they know you, and you say, hey, how about if this year's event, I want to try something different. So I would do it on some safe, known territory where you know them, they know you, the trust level is high. I would do it. I would try it there.
Awesome. Well, Joe Calloway, my friend, colleague, Speaker Hall of Fame, CPAE, thank you so much for your wisdom, and let's stay in touch.
Let's do. Have a great day, everybody.
You too. Thanks so much. And for those of you who are listening, make sure that you subscribe to our podcast at some point. We'd love to have you as part of our team of people who are on a crusade to make all panel discussions lively and informative. Thanks for listening and watching.